chapter 6.
Is it second day of that she has the king and Haman for a banquet? Is that
Okay, that's today.
That's today.
Yes, so today we get to the second banquet. What happened on the night between the two banquets? It's very entertaining.
He was reading the Chronicle,
Mm-hmm.
and found that Mordecai had exposed a plot against him, and hadn't been honored.
Right. So that's what he read, and then how did it go after that? This really is just one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible.
The king asks what they've done to honor him through, and it slipped through the cracks. So then he asks Mordecai, and Mordecai Haman, he
Yeah.
asks Haman about it, and asks him what he would do to honor such a person. And Haman assumes he's talking about himself, so he lays out this incredible path of honor, and it turns on a dime because the king was talking about Mordecai.
And why was Haman there in the first place?
Why was he there?
In the court of the king.
Oh, he came with the, yeah, that's right, and had the plot, he wanted to present the plot, the king,
Yep.
let's just hang
Yeah.
Mordecai today.
That's right.
On this gallows.
That's right. He was there to ask permission to execute Mordecai, and instead, it's not just that he had the idea, that ended up being for Mordecai, it's that then the king told Haman to be the one to parade him around the city. It was really great. And then how did things go when Haman went home? Yeah. And it was really interesting because her response wasn't just like, oh, bad luck. Try again, though, I'm sure. Her whole thing was, there's no way you're going to succeed in this. And do you remember why she said? Because he's a Jew. And I think the implication underneath that is she knows something about the God of Israel, even if she's a pagan, because God has this reputation for preserving his people. He's been doing it for centuries. And she already thinks, uh-oh, this is a bad omen. If you go against this Jew, and you have, that spells your doom. Do you remember the last thing that happened in the end of that chapter?
They took the king's heart, and eunuch came and took him away from the banquet.
Yep, they haul him off to go to this banquet. You get this sense now Haman has started to lose control, because now they're coming and taking him away, and if you know what's coming, you know that's not good. There was a woman at Set Free last night, or yesterday, when we read that verse. She's like, oh, it's another cliffhanger, dun, dun, dun. She still didn't know what happened, and then she looked out and she's like, oh, the section heading says he gets executed. Does he get executed? Read it yourself. I don't want to read ahead. I'm going to spoil it. She was like, all right, so Haman has been hurried off to the second banquet, so let's read chapter 7 and 8. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a gallows 75 feet high stands behind Haman's house. He made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's fury subsided. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor, and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling dispatches that Haman son of Hammedatha the Agagite devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and now they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all of Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, riding the royal horses, raced out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was also issued in the citadel of Susa. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews, because fear of the Jews had seized them. Okay, so how does chapter 7 open in verses 1 and 2?
King and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther,
Mm-hmm.
and on that second day, the king asked Esther again, what is your petition, and shall be granted to you?
Mm-hmm. And I don't think Esther's procrastinating when she has 2 banquets. She's buttering him up. She's giving him lots of hospitality, lots of respect. And at the same time, by the time she actually puts her request to him, he will have said to her 3 times that he will do whatever she asks, up to half the kingdom. And it's going to be really hard for him to turn her down now without losing face when he's done this and when she's extended so much hospitality to him. So she's got a plan. And now she really has to come out with the request she has. And she has to start this really delicate task of accusing Haman without incriminating the king. Because the king and Haman issued this edict together. It was the king's authority that allowed this edict to go out. She has to figure out a way to incite the king against his closest advisor and do it without bringing down the wrath of the king on her. I mean, we know what happened to Vashti when she rocked the boat. So how is Esther going to do this in a way that gets him angry at Haman and not at her, and doesn't accuse the king in any way? Well, what does she say in verses 3 and 4?
If I found favor with you, and if it pleases you, grant me my life, spare my people, for we have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated.
Mm-hmm. It's so brilliant, because not only does she start off phrasing things in a way that's really respectful, but then the first thing she says is, spare me my life, which is really dramatic. I mean, it's a dramatic way to start with the queen saying, keep me from getting killed. Wow. I mean, it's really shocking, and it's supposed to be, I think, Not only because this whole issue is about life and death, but because the implication of that is that someone is threatening the life of the queen behind the king's back. That's how it looks, the way that she phrases all of this, is that there's somebody plotting against her and the king doesn't know about it. Now, it's going to be even more shocking, both to him and to Haman, because neither one of them knows that she's a Jew. So at the moment, they have no idea that this edict that has gone out is in any way connected to her. And the irony, of course, is that Haman is not actually plotting against the queen or against the king, but it's going to look that way before it's over. It's going to look like he is stabbing the king in the back. And here's Esther revealing to the king what it is that Haman is doing without him knowing it. So she starts off, spare my life, and then she adds the request to spare her people. And she says they've been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated, which is actually a quote from the edict. So she just takes the words of the edict and puts them right here. But these two men, I think, still haven't realized where this is going. She wants to shock the king, and it works. And then, well, what's that bit of humility she throws in at the end of verse 4?
Well, how did yours read? Because I think mine reading.
Well, the end of that verse is a little bit difficult, but basically what she's saying is, if it were just a matter of slavery, I wouldn't have bothered you. But because it's a matter of annihilation, I thought maybe I could just inconvenience you enough and maybe.
And what's your last sentence?
So mine says, if we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king.
And mine says, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So, like, the devastation would be so, you lose all your slaves,
Yeah.
you're in trouble.
Yeah, like if everybody dies, it's going to be so inconvenient for you.
Yeah.
You know.
All right.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because Esther's doing right now what the advisors did before. She's phrasing things in a way that plays to the king's pride and makes all of this about his own self-interest. That's what the advisors did in chapter 1, that's what Haman did, and that's what Esther's doing now. The king's response, well, how does he respond when she puts it the way she does?
Yes, who would dare kill?
Where is it?
Yeah, he's angry.
Who would
Like,
dare kill her and her people?
yeah, it makes him look bad to have someone attacking the queen behind his back. And so, yeah, who would dare to do such a thing?
My
And
my
yeah, go
Bible
ahead.
says, who would presume
Mhm.
to do this? Because they know what kind of power I have.
Mhm.
And where is he?
Yeah,
Who is he and where is he?
that's right. And Esther could have said, well, you're the one who issued the edict, don't you? But she doesn't because who's she after? She's after Haman. So, what happens next? 5 to 7.
She exposes Haman.
And it's interesting when the king says, who is he, where is he, this man who dared do such a thing? And she says, the adversary and enemy. She doesn't say my adversary and enemy. She says the adversary and enemy, which implies it's his enemy too. She says the enemy is this guy Haman. The whole implication being he's the one stabbing you in the back by trying to attack the queen and all of her people without him knowing it. What's Haman's response?
He's terrified.
Well, what do you think about that? I mean, here was a guy who was really full of himself for the last couple of chapters, who seemed to have all this power.
Now the king is look
I mean, it's just interesting how quickly he went from being arrogant and powerful to being groveling and scared to death because he realizes what's just happened, that now the king has turned on him. And so, yeah, he's terrified. So the king gets up in a rage, leaves his wine. I was thinking it takes a lot to make him leave his wine, doesn't it? Leaves his wine. And he goes outside to take a turn in the garden, and I'm sure what he's doing is just trying to collect himself and decide what he's going to do next. For him, this is not about the annihilation of the Jews. This is about the betrayal of his closest advisor. And Haman doesn't argue, he doesn't defend himself, he doesn't even try to stand up to the king. The reaction of the king, I think, tells him he's done for. And it turns out he's a total coward. He's powerful enough to plot the execution of Mordecai and all the Jews. But now he's just reduced to what? What does he do next? Think about the irony of that. Okay, so how did we get into this whole situation to start with? There was a Jewish man who would not bow down to an Amalekite. And now you have an Amalekite bowing down to who? A Jewish woman. That reversal is so fascinating that it's not that he's bowing down to Mordecai, it's that he's bowing down to a woman who's a Jew. Because she's the only one he knows who could intervene and spare his life right now. So he starts begging her for help. And then what happens when the king comes back?
Haman sprawled out over Queen Esther's baby. And it doesn't look good.
It does not.
And then I left out, and then the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?
Yeah.
So anyway, off to the 70-foot pole, he puts up and Mordecai.
Yeah. I mean, I get the impression he's just collapsed at her couch or whatever because he's begging for mercy. But that was a huge mistake, actually, because the historians say no man was allowed to approach or be left alone with any woman who belonged to the Persian king. So he should not have even been alone in the room with her. But of course, he's so scared, he's begging for his life, and then when the king comes back in, he's caught in this situation that looks really compromising. It looks even worse now, not only that he's violated the royal protocol, but it looks like what the king's already thinking, which is that Haman's betraying him by going after the queen. Haman's trapped, and Esther's the one who trapped him. And so now the king's closest advisor ends up looking like a traitor, even though he wasn't actually plotting against the king, but that's how it looks now. All right, so the king accuses Haman of attacking the queen, and then it says they come and cover his face. What that means is the king's men come and they take him prisoner, and they put a cover over his head. So covering his face was covering his head, and that's what they did with people when they arrested them to take them away. And then there's this guy, one of the attendants, is really helpful and speaks up right here.
Yes.
What does he say?
I thought that was really
I
interesting.
did too. What does he say?
He says there's a big pole stands outside Haman's house, and he had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help you.
Because you remember what just happened to Mordecai. The king just honored Mordecai by having him paraded through the city because he knows that Mordecai foiled this assassination plot. So here's this attendant who's really helpful in just saying, oh, by the way, this guy who you think was betraying you, he was about to try to execute Mordecai who saved your life. Now he really looks like a traitor, Haman does, if he's trying to assassinate the guy who spoke up for the king.
Have you said we don't know if these eunuchs were Jews or not?
I doubt, we don't know. I think it's probably unlikely, but it's possible, I guess. But I think that, everybody knew what Haman had done because how big were the gallows? Like a 7-story building. I mean, it's enormous. Everybody knows what Haman has done. And so, yeah, this attendant says he was coming that day to have Mordecai executed. And so the king says, well, let's just execute Haman on the gallows that were there for Mordecai. The coincidences and irony are really breathtaking. And that this person who had so much power in the empire has lost it so quickly. And you see how the pride and the rashness and the temper of the king, which meant the end for Vashti, actually played right into the hands of Esther. It's just brilliant what she did to get him to turn against Haman and not against her. And what's more important is that she is a Benjamite, and she is about to succeed where King Saul failed. Because it's not just Haman who's going to be executed, it's the enemies of the Jews, including his sons, who are the Amalekites. The ones that Saul didn't wipe out, they're going to get wiped out under the reign of Esther. She's going to do what Saul didn't. And, well, we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 9. But very interesting that it's a woman. It's the queen of Persia who does what Saul should have done back in 1 Samuel. Okay, now, how does chapter 8 begin in verses 1 and 2?
Very day, the king gave the house of enemy of Haman to Esther.
Yeah. So when he gets executed, because he's executed as a traitor to the throne, according to the law, his property was confiscated and given to the person he had wronged. So in this case, Esther's the person that he wronged. So the king gives Haman's estate to her. And then she reveals her connection to Mordecai and appoints Mordecai the head over Haman's estate. So remember that prediction from Haman's family, that Mordecai would be the end of him. Oh yeah, like it's not just that Mordecai was spared and Haman wasn't. It's that now Mordecai has taken over what belonged to Haman. And then what does Esther do in verse 3?
She came forward with her supplication to continue saving her people.
Right.
Because it's not enough just to save herself and kinsmen.
Mhm.
But now she is supplicating to the king and calling him wishes.
Yeah. It kind of kills me right here that the genocide obviously isn't the king's biggest, it's not his biggest concern. Like his concern was Haman, but she has to come back a second time and say, wait, there's an annihilation planned of all these people in the empire. And so she comes again to him and pleads on behalf of her people. And how does he respond?
In verse 2, it says he took off his signet ring, so he must have grabbed that back from Haman pretty quickly, because he gave it to Haman in the first place and told him that he could do whatever he wanted with it.
Yep.
As far as the annihilation of the Jews were concerned, he's really kind of funny about his ring, I think.
Yeah, he does.
Not funny to me, because the signet ring is the king. I mean,
It's
that
his
stands
authority.
for the king.
That's right. Yeah. So he takes it back from the Amalekite and gives it to the Jew, which is really interesting. Yeah.
There's a fascinating detail, and that's back in verse 10:7.
Mm-hmm.
Then the king's fury subsided. So he had this huge storm of anger, and then his fury subsided after this judgment, which allows him to be more rational with the next part of the story.
Yeah.
And you think, how much of this did the Lord have charge of? And then the fury subsides, which allows them to act more rationally towards Esther.
Mhm.
Mordecai,
Yeah.
and the ear of the Lord.
Yeah. And then she says, if it pleases him, if he regards her with favor, if he thinks it's the right thing to do, if he's pleased with her, then let this order be written that goes out throughout the empire. Now you know the edict that Haman sent out can't be revoked. But what they can do is send out something that will overrule it. And so that's what she asks him to do. An edict that will overrule what Haman did. This edict that he wrote to destroy all of the Jews in the empire. And what does he do in 7 and 8? How does he respond?
Well, it's total, do what you think is best. I mean,
Yep.
that's a blanket statement.
Yes, it is.
Giving her the power to do what the king has.
Uh-huh.
Do what you think is best.
Yep.
That's an amazing statement.
Yes, it is. And it's amazing that he gives that kind of power to the queen.
Yes.
That's the kind of power he previously gave to Haman. And now he's giving it to Esther instead. Because, yeah, go ahead.
With the signet ring.
Yeah.
And
And you notice again, no questions, no investigations, no discussing it. It's just, he just passes the whole thing off on Esther and Mordecai and says, do whatever you like, here's the ring to make it official. And, I mean, he's no better ruler than he ever was, but now it's Esther and Mordecai who are wielding the power of the king instead of Haman the Amalekite. It kind of kills me, they keep talking through here about Mordecai the Jew, Haman the Agagite, and Mordecai the Jew. Just a little reminder, there are ancient things going on right here with this reversal. Things that that are related to the promises that God had made way back 1,000 years before this. Okay, so what happens then in 9 to 14?
So it seems like Mordecai had a really wise plan, very detailed,
Mm-hmm.
and he put it in text.
And what, so he sends this edict out through the whole empire, and again, this empire is enormous. So it goes all the way from India to Sudan to Turkey. It's huge. So they send out this decree to the whole empire, and what does he say in this decree?
One, you have right to assemble and protect themselves. Two, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed forces that attack them and plunder the property of their enemies.
Mhm.
And this was on the 15th day of the 12th month.
Which was the day the lots had chosen. Right? So this is the day that Haman had cast the dice for, but now on that date, previously under the decree of Haman, the government officials, the nobles, all of that, they were all supposed to participate in this annihilation of the Jews. But now, the Jews have the right to stand up for themselves, to defend themselves, and actually what we'll see is the nobles and the officials come to their defense instead. So their enemies are still going to try to attack them, but now they have the right to arm themselves and to fight. And it echoes the things going on in this edict, echo the same things that Haman had said before, but now they have the right to plunder the property of their enemies and to destroy anyone who comes against them. And what's the outcome then for Mordecai and the Jews in 15 to 17?
Mordecai's changed from sackcloth to royal robes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Large crown of gold and purple,
Yep.
purple rose, fine
Uh-huh. So Mordecai and Haman have traded places. So it's not just that Mordecai spared and Haman's executed. Mordecai has taken over Haman's position and his property and his power. He's taken over everything that Haman had. The Amalekite's been replaced by a Jew, the Jew he was planning to kill. Yeah. And what else with the people?
Yeah.
They too have gone from sackcloth and ashes to now feasting and celebrating. Right?
Happiness, joy, gladness, and honor.
And it gets repeated over and over just to make it really clear, yeah, how joyful they are.
But they didn't take any of the people's property. Matthew Henry says that they let that, I mean, they killed the soldiers or whoever was out to kill them, but they left their property for the children and the wives.
Well, we'll come back to that next week.
Oh, okay.
Because not taking the plunder is part of what reverses the sin of Saul. The sin of Saul,
Yeah, that's right.
because Saul took the plunder when he shouldn't have.
Okay.
And the Jews under Esther are not going to take the plunder because they're going to see this whole situation as a judgment by God on the Amalekites and their enemies. So, yeah, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that in chapter 9. It's okay? Yeah.
Okay, so many people of nationalities became Jews, so I need that explained.
Well, people converted.
But I thought to be a Jew, you had to be...
Well, they adopted the Jewish religion, so they become proselytes. They become,
Okay.
yeah, they convert to Judaism,
Okay.
basically. Yeah. All right, now let's just talk about the reversal that's going on right here, because there's some interesting things happening. 9 to 17, verses 9 to 17 are a parallel of chapter 3, but with everything getting reversed. So the author describes this second edict using details that echo the first one. Some of the language is exactly the same, verbatim, as it was in chapter 3, but now everything's being undone. And that's interesting because it provides a sort of clue to the literary structure, and that structure is really significant. So we're going to stop and talk about that for a minute. There's this handout that I passed around last week that has this chart and a diagram on it. Looks like this, which might be helpful. It might not, but it might be. Because I'm going to refer to the diagram and the chart right here, because the book of Esther is very carefully crafted. So it's not that the author was like, I'm going to tell the story of Esther, so he just starts and keeps talking till he comes to the end, and that's that. He has crafted the story in a very particular way to make a point. So one of the things he's done is he's included a couple of literary structures that are very interesting, very unusual in non-narrative accounts. So there's two different structures. One is called a chiasm, or a chiasm, and the other one is called peripety. You don't have to remember those are like $1 million literary words, but here's what it means. So a chiasm is a way of structuring the text so that there are ideas or topics that get repeated in reverse order. So the author will present a list of things, and then he'll do it again in reverse order. And what it does is it ends up making something of a mirror effect in the structure of the text. Now, that's really common in poetry. If you read in the Psalms, this kind of structure is all over the Psalms. It's not so common in a nonfiction account, but here's how he did it. He did it with the banquets. So there's this diagram right in the middle of that page that has all of the banquets connected. There are these 8 banquets that are listed in Esther. And the way they're described, there are parallels between those banquets that connect them together. So if you see in that list the first banquet and the 7th banquet, which I labeled A1 and A2, they parallel each other. And the second banquet, B1, and the last banquet, B2, parallel each other. They're connected together. And then the 3rd banquet and the 6th banquet are connected together because there are similarities between those banquets. And then you have the 2 banquets that Esther throws that are right in the middle, the 1st and the 2nd banquet that Esther hosts, D1 and D2. Okay, now, that's all very interesting, but why does it matter? Well, the reason that an author does that in a nonfiction account like this is in order to put an emphasis on whatever's in the middle. So this kind of structure focuses on whatever's in the center of that chiasm. And the center of this one is between D1 and D2. It's between the 2 banquets. What happens between the 2 banquets? The king can't sleep, right? The night between the 2 banquets, the king can't sleep, the coincidences all pile up, and then Haman happens to show up when he does, and then Mordecai gets honored. That's what happens between those 2 banquets. Now that's very interesting because there's this focus now where the author has said that's the center of the story, is that night when the king has insomnia. Okay, now the other structure that he's put in is called peripety, and peripety is just a fancy way of saying a structure of reversals. So, in peripety, there's something that happens to cause a turn of events in the story where things don't just change, but they reverse the direction they were going. So everything that happened before now comes undone. It's like all the events that happened previously start to unravel at this pivot point in the story where the reversal starts. Now, that chart at the bottom gives you some of those details. So in chapter 3, the king gives Haman his signet ring. In chapter 8, the king gives Mordecai his signet ring. In chapter 3, Haman summons the king's scribes. In chapter 8, Mordecai summons the king's scribes. The letters are written and sealed by Haman in chapter 3. The letters are written and sealed by Mordecai in chapter 8. In chapter 3, the Jews, including the women and the children, were supposed to be killed in one day. In chapter 8, it's the enemies, including the women and children, who are going to be killed in one day. In chapter 3, Haman's decree goes out as law. In chapter 8, Mordecai's decree goes out as law. The couriers go out in both cases. In chapter 3, the city of Susa was totally perplexed. In chapter 8, the city of Susa rejoices. In chapter 4, Mordecai was wearing sackcloth and ashes. We mentioned that. In chapter 8, Mordecai's wearing royal robes. In chapter 4, Mordecai was going through the city crying. In chapter 6, he's led through the city with honor. In chapter 5, Haman's wife was advising that Mordecai would die, and in chapter 6, she's predicting that Haman will die. You see how all those things connect up together, where there's this reversal that happens. Now, why would the author structure the story that way? The same reason he does it with the chiasm, because what he's doing is putting an emphasis on whatever is in the middle. And what's in the middle of this reversal is whatever happens between the time that Haman is advised by his wife and the time when he is told that he's going to come to his ruin. Coincidentally, the center of the peripety is exactly the same place as the center of the chiasm. The center point of the story in this structure too is on the night between the two banquets, when the king can't sleep. That is the pivot point of the story. Okay, now here's the question, all that, okay, why does it matter? Why would the author intentionally structure the story in a way that puts the pivot point, the center of the narrative, on the one event that nobody in the story controls?
Because God controls it.
That's right. It's like the author saying, who is really in control? It's not the king, because all he did was not go to sleep, right? And then all those coincidences that lined up. It's not like the king had any idea what he was doing when he called Haman in and said, I want to honor this guy. He had no clue what was going on with Haman. Haman didn't know what was going on. He thought he was going to be honored. Like, all these coincidences pile up right in the middle of the story. It's not the king who's in control. It's not Haman who's in control. It's not Esther who's in control. It's like being on a seesaw, and you're headed this direction, and all of a sudden somebody's finger just tips the seesaw the other way. And that's what God did. He just reached in, pushed the button, tipped the seesaw, and all of a sudden everything started flowing the opposite direction. And all the stuff that came before it now starts to come undone. And it's God who starts the reversal. That's important because Esther plays this significant part in the story, but Esther doesn't set the reversal in motion. The reversal has already started by the time Esther confronts Haman. She plays a part in that reversal, but she's not the one who initiates it. The God who never gets mentioned is the one who initiates it. Why does that matter for us?
We don't have to hear God's name mentioned to know it's God. Somebody doesn't have to speak that out loud. It's spoken in the heart. It's just incredible.
Well, is his finger tipping things today?
Yeah.
And the thing is, you might not see it, right? I mean, think about all the things that happened on that night in the palace and how many people were actually privy to that. The majority of the Jews in the empire had no idea what happened in the king's bedroom the night that he couldn't sleep. But here's the author showing us, pulling the curtain back so we can see all those coincidences line up. And it's so jaw-dropping that at some point someone is in control. And it's not because there's a big miracle that happens. It's not because a prophet shows up. It's not anything spectacular that would have gotten everyone's attention. It's a really quiet, under the surface, behind the scenes, somebody pulling the strings in order to turn everything in the direction that he wants it to go. And it's not just that he reverses things so there's a good outcome for the Jews. It's that he reverses things in order to fulfill the promises that he made 1,000 years before this, to preserve a remnant of his people and to wipe out the Amalekites. And he's pulling things into place in order to do exactly what he wants to do. But he never gets mentioned because how quiet is all of that stuff? It's that my favorite commentator calls it mustard seed mode. This idea that it's just so under the surface that it's the kinds of things most people would never even notice. But you can't help but see it in the middle of Esther, that there is someone in control orchestrating things, turning the heart of the king exactly the way he wants it to.
And so when we hear the news today, we can just say, oh, remember Mordecai and Esther?
That's right.
God's got something, he's doing something right now.
Yep.
And why should I get so wrapped up in all this when, just thank God because he's at work.
Yeah.
And after the rapture, I should think about, at least if I understand this correctly, you where that tipping point is, and for people to, without, because it's really godless, it's more godless, right? So it's just like, this is almost a precursor to, or not precursor, what's the word, is a foreshadow of what ultimately will happen.
Well, let me ask you this. If you were to think about human history as it is right now, has there been an event that you would say is the pivot point of history?
Right, it's resurrection.
The resurrection of Jesus. That's the ultimate pivot point. That is where the biggest reversal started. And so everything that comes after that, we're in the process now of undoing everything that came before because Jesus walked out of his own grave. And I think when you see the redemptive reversals in Scripture, Esther is a huge one, but it's not the only one. There are other places where God does the same sort of thing. Why does that matter for us? Not because in your particular situation today, God might reverse it so that you have a happy ending. Maybe he will and maybe he won't. But the point is to foreshadow the bigger redemptive reversal, which is the resurrection of Jesus, where death gets defeated and everything that Satan and death and evil and sin have done are in the process now of becoming unraveled. Because, well, in Lord of the Rings, there's a character who says, everything sad will come untrue. It's that kind of idea, like because of what Jesus has done, we are headed now in an opposite direction. Even though we will experience death, it's lost its sting because everything is now headed for a different outcome.
Sally, one of the things that keeps coming to my mind, and it runs all through Scripture, even through the crucifixion, and then of course Christ returns, and it's the same thing for Haman and Mordecai and the gallows and everything, is that you meant it for evil, but God means it for good.
That's right.
He eventually turns all things that these people are plotting for evil to good. And I have to keep my mind focused on that because we see so much evil, and it just feels like evil's winning. And you go about meant for evil, God means for good. And you see it all through Scripture.
All right, any last comments?
Just thought it was interesting, we talked about it last time, but about the fact that even though this king had all the power, he had a kind side to him. I mean, when he allowed Esther to come to him when she wasn't summoned, and then he kept giving, he promised her half the kingdom, which was, more than that. But also, these Jews who were in captivity must have demonstrated their faith in God somehow in front of these people, because Nehemiah got the same treatment. When he came before the king and had a sad face, the king said, "What's the matter? You're sad today." And then he said, "What can I give you?" And I think that's something that should be a real lesson for us, is that we behave as we always should, no matter what situation we're in. And these people have been brought up to amazing places in those kingdoms, didn't they? Daniel and Nehemiah.
But they all told to